Hey friends, welcome back to another session of our study Follow Me, learning to walk in the footsteps of our Rabbi Jesus. So 2 years ago, there was a really significant event that happened in Kentucky. It was called the Asbury Revival. I don't know if you followed this story, but it was really fascinating. So tiny college campus, Asbury. One day they were having normal chapel service, and this soccer coach gets up to give the chapel talk. In hindsight, he himself admitted, yeah, it wasn't a very good talk. In fact, the president of the university said, I agree, it was pretty average. Nevertheless, at the end of this very average talk on a very mundane chapel service, a few of the students, just about half a dozen, stayed after the service ended, and they kept singing and they kept praying, and 30 minutes went by, and then an hour went by, and then a few more students came back into the auditorium, and they started singing, they started praying, and then 2-3 more hours passed by, and then food is brought in so they can eat, and then dozens of more students show up, and by the end of that evening there's several hundred students in that chapel singing, praying, and they decide to stay the night. Well, then other people start finding about this, and more people start traveling to Asbury to join what started becoming known as the Asbury Revival. So when it was all said and done, this revival lasted 16 days, 24/7, and get this, 70,000 people from all over the world came to be part of this revival. So the whole auditorium was just full of people, and there was a line outside the door almost a half mile long, and people would wait even in the middle of the night just to get into a session for 30 or 40 minutes. It was amazing, and I read a lot about it and followed it, and one of the things that stuck out to me was it was led mainly by millennials and young people, and there were several times where Christian, like contemporary Christian artists, celebrities would come to the revival, and they would say, hey, do you want us to, put on a little concert for the people? And the leaders would say, actually, no. Like, if you want to come pray and repent, you're welcome to do that. But this really isn't about fame or glory or getting well-known people in here. This is just about us coming to the Lord. And so they refused these famous people. And then in a similar fashion, national news outlets would come and try to cover the story, and the students kept saying, we really don't want to do interviews. We don't want this on national TV. This is not about publicity. We just feel like we need to repent. And so there was this incredible sense of authenticity to the revival. Now, as I've thought about it in the aftermath, I have several observations. One, I think it does show that God is still at work today. Like, he's on the move, as C.S. Lewis says in the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, we don't move God, but I think we can be caught up in the move of God when we are open to his leading and to his spirit. God is alive. Two, I think that unity is possible. Sometimes when we read John 17 and that prayer that Jesus prayed, I think, yeah, that's not going to happen. But the Asbury Revival makes me think maybe it can happen, because of those 70,000 people, they represented so many different parts and tribes and traditions within Christendom. But when Jesus is at the center, I do think unity is possible, because that's why everybody was coming, is they simply wanted to worship Jesus. Even some of the students who ran the revival said they were aware of all the social dynamics of the college and who didn't like who and what social group was mad at whoever. But they said during those 16 days, these people put their differences aside, and they just came together under the banner of love and under the banner of King Jesus, and unity did happen. My third observation came from a book I was reading at the time. So I happened to be watching the revival and reading this book at the same time. So here's my third observation. I think we, in general, have a passion problem. The reason I say that is because the book I was reading at the time, the title it was called Overcoming Apathy. And it was a book about apathy and passion. And one of the points that the author made was that he talked about what he calls the passion paradox. And the passion paradox goes like this. He said it's not that we have no passion. It's that we have passion about really trivial things. And I resonated with that. As I observe culture, friends, the church, it seems like we get really excited about things that aren't that important. So we maybe we or you have a lot of passion about your front lawn or your appearance, like what you put on today, or we are passionate about people we follow on social media or YouTube, or we're really passionate about the TV shows we like or the movies that we like, or we're just really passionate about some very specific angle of politics or the 24-hour news cycle, and we get all sucked into this one thing happening across the world, which we can do nothing about, but all of our energy is put into that. So we are passionate. We're not necessarily passionate about the things of God. And to be the first confessor here, my relationship with the thunder it borders on emotionally unhealthy. Like it is crazy how invested I am, as are many people in this state of Oklahoma, into the thunder. So we do care. It's just that we tend to spend all of our passion on things that don't have a lot to do with God. And so then the problem becomes there's just not a lot left to give to the Lord. So another point this book made, which was really eye-opening to me, is the author talked about the history of apathy, especially like the last 30, 40 years. And apparently, at least some of the blame can be placed at the hands of a super popular TV show that I think is absolutely hilarious. Seinfeld. I think it's one of the funniest shows of all time. Well, apparently it made a massive shift in culture in the U.S. There had never been a show quite like it. A show where there really weren't any moral lessons. A show where it's even been said there's going to be no hugging and no morals. And when you watch the show, you can actually see that there's not a lot of that going on. In fact, at the very last episode, the writers of the show put a line on the lips of the judge. So at the end of the whole series, the main four characters go to jail, and at their sentencing, this judge says something which this is a summary of what the writers thought that the show did to culture. So here's this quote. I don't know how or wonder under what circumstances the four of you found each other, but your callous indifference and utter disregard for everything that is good and decent has rocked the very foundation upon which our society is built. So that's what the writers thought that the show did to culture. Your callous indifference and disregard for everything that is good. Now this is hard because I think the show is funny, but what this shows us is that it bred a lot of sarcasm and it bred a lot of apathy. And those aren't necessarily the virtues that we want to embody as Christian people. And so we're going to get into a text here about what it means to follow the passion of Jesus in just a minute. But right now, let's pause and let's reflect a little bit on apathy. So in this series, we've talked a lot about walking with Jesus, being like Jesus, how he prayed, the pace at which he lived life. Today, I'd like to reflect on what would it look like to care like Jesus cared. Think about the last few days of his life. He goes to Jerusalem and he weeps because he cares. He cares about these people. They're sinful, they're broken, and his heart goes out to them. He goes to Gethsemane and he sweats drops of blood because he cares. They put a cross on his back and he walks to Golgotha, telling people along the way to take care of each other. He goes up to the cross, again, speaking to John and his mother, saying, hey, you're going to have to take care of each other when I'm gone. He says these things because he cares. From the cross, he looks at these Roman soldiers and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I mean, this is incredible what Jesus does at the end of his life. And all those events put together historically have been called the Passion of the Christ. And so don't you think it makes sense that if we are apprentices under the Rabbi, the Savior, Jesus Christ, wouldn't we want to care like he cared? And so what do you think that would look like? How would we go about developing the passion of Jesus? Paul has a great line in Romans 12. He says, never be lacking in zeal, but keep up your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. So zeal, that's just another word for passion. And Paul seems to indicate, you know what, there might be days coming when you want to lack in zeal, but he says, no, don't be lacking in zeal. And that's the hard part, is that I think our passion is going down, and how do we care? How do we build it back up? So there's a passage in Luke I want to dive into it. I almost want you to think about, what if you could view apathy like a disease or a dysfunction or an ailment, and you were to go to Jesus for healing? What would that look like? So I'd like to read a story, but in the back of your mind, think about what Jesus would want to do with our apathy. So this is Luke 13, verse 10. On a Sabbath, Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues, and a woman was there who had been crippled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her forward and said to her, Woman, you are set free from your infirmity. So a few things to notice about this story. First, she's been crippled for 18 years. And she doesn't ask Jesus to be healed. Jesus approaches her. Why do you think that is? Well, I'm speculating a bit here, but I wonder if the reason that she didn't ask Jesus to be healed is because she was used to her ailment. Sometimes I think that we befriend our dysfunction. So when you have a sinful behavior in your life, at first, it probably makes you feel guilty and you're not proud of it. Maybe is gambling for you. And the first few times you placed a bet, you're thinking, oh, this isn't a good idea. But once you get into that cycle of addiction, it just becomes normal. What used to be intrusive becomes inclusive. It's just, oh yeah, this is just part of who I am. I think that happens a lot with sin. We befriend it. We get used to the dysfunction. Just like this woman's been hurting for 18 years. And so it's just, yeah, this is just part of who I am. This is what I do. Now, the second thing to point out from the story is, if you'll notice in verse 16, Jesus says, should this woman, whom Satan has kept bound for 18 years, shouldn't she be set free? And so apparently Jesus thinks that this ailment, this dysfunction, is actually a work of the devil. And I wonder how many times that we think there's something just minor. Well, I haven't prayed in a while, or yeah, I don't really care about people these days. You know, as we reflect on our own issues, I wonder if Jesus were here, how often he would tell us, yeah, that the work of the devil is actually more present in your life than you think. So Jesus is ascribing her ailment to a work of the devil. Now, one final thought here about the story is that Jesus wants to set her free. This is actually really hopeful. So she's not coming up to Jesus saying, oh, Jesus, I've been hurting for so long. Can you set me free? No, Jesus sees her. He's like, yeah, I want to heal you. The desire of Jesus is to liberate you from whatever binds you. So I think we're all bound up by something, usually, in life. So like if you're bound by anxiety, then the desire of Jesus is to set you free from that anxiety. If you're bound by fear or hatred or some addiction, Jesus doesn't want you to stay that way. He sees you for who you could be. He loves you for who you are, but he sees you for who you could be. And so he wants to set you free. And so I think if you're feeling really apathetic, I would guess Jesus wants to set you free from that apathy, because apathy is not from the Lord. More and more, I'm convinced it's a sin. That the word, the way that we use it's not used in the Bible itself, although there's strong allusions to it. So, for example, in the book of Revelation, chapter 2, we simply find that famous line, you have forsaken your first love. It's a powerful line. Like, it's like you used to have this affection for Jesus, and there used to be a way of life you would live, but it's just been muted over time. You've fallen away from that first love. That's pretty close to saying you've become apathetic. There's a great quote about apathy from Dorothy Sayers. So here's how she defines apathy. Apathy is the sin which believes in nothing, cares for nothing, seeks to know nothing, interferes with nothing, enjoys nothing, loves nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, and only remains alive because there is nothing it would die for. It's a really, really thought-provoking definition. Let's pause right there and talk a little bit about the nature of this apathy and the text that we just read. So, what are we supposed to do about apathy? There's another story that I'd like to mention briefly, which I think is really instructive on that particular question. Do you remember the story of Zacchaeus from Luke 19? It's a short story, but there's transformation at the heart of it. So Zacchaeus is a tax collector. He leverages his position of power to oppress the Jewish people by charging them arbitrarily whatever he wants to for their taxes. And they hate him for that. Well, then Zacchaeus meets Jesus. And by the end of this encounter, he's a radically different person. He's repenting. He's giving back 4 times the amount to anybody he's wronged. And he's giving half of his possessions to the poor. It's an amazing transformative story. And I really think it's applicable because he goes from someone that apparently has some apathy, at least towards these Jewish people that he's oppressing, and then by the end of the story, he's passionate. He's passionate about Jesus, passionate about God's mission. I mean, it's an amazing story of transformation. So I'm interested in, okay, how did that happen? Well, first of all, I think the Spirit has to be at play. I think being in the presence of Jesus is really important. But at a very practical level, I think there's 2 things that are going on, or at least 2 questions that derive from that story. Question 1 is, what do I need to care less about? So for Zacchaeus, he started caring less about something in that story. And question 2 is, what do I need to care more about? So in this story, those 2 things happen to Zacchaeus. There's one thing he starts to care less about, and there's another thing he starts to care more about. So for Zacchaeus, it's fairly simple. He cares less about money, and he cares more about people. And so I think those 2 questions are really helpful in addressing apathy. So you might start reflecting right now, what do you need to care less about? I have a friend who called me the other day and said something really convicting to me. He said, unprompted, he said, Phil, I've decided to make a change in my life. I was like, what's that? He said, I check ESPN.com way too often. So I've just decided I'm not going to check it at all during the day. And that was convicting to me because I really like sports and I tend to check ESPN.com a lot. And a while later, he was reflecting on that new habit he was forming, and he said, it's great because I now am surprised at the end of the day about what happened in the sports world. And I really appreciate that story because there's nothing wrong with ESPN.com. There's nothing wrong with sports. But I think for my friend, he realized he was putting all his passion into this thing that at the end of the day doesn't matter that much. and so therefore he didn't have as much for the Lord. Back to the passion paradox. And so he decided he needed to care less about that. So what would that be for you? What do you need to care less about it? Again, is that a certain friend that you're obsessed with, or a relationship that you can't stop thinking about this particular person, or is it some hobby that you just all day long it's all you can think about, or is that again some part of the news or some part of politics that you're just so fired up about? Like what is it for you? What do you need to care less about? And then the second question is really important too. What do you need to care more about? Later today, I'm going to a meeting where there's a group of people getting together to talk about what can churches in this city do to be a neighbor to people who are oppressed. Like that's a really important question. That all around us, there are homeless people. There's victims of sex trafficking. There are so many people that really struggle just around like in my context around our church building, and I'm oblivious to that. Well, there's some people getting together to talk about it, and I'm going to go to that meeting, and I hope I'm convicted. Like I want to care more about those kinds of people. I know it's important. I know it's really critical to the heart of God, and that's an area where I want to care more about those kinds of people. And the thing with passion is it's really contagious. It just takes one or two people to get passionate about something, and then it really does start to spread. I'm reminded of a story my friend told me recently. We were going out to lunch, and he said that he had a foreign exchange student for 9 months from Sweden, and her name was Sabrina, and she lived in his house. And she comes from an atheist country. She was an atheist because her parents were atheists. And so my friend said, well, we go to church. You don't have to come. And she said, well, I'll come along. And so she went to church for a few months and thought it was interesting. Didn't believe any of it, but would go along just to be nice. Well, one weekend my friend went to a youth rally, and Sabrina went along with them. And at this youth rally, there was a video that was played, and it was teenagers reading the Bible in various languages, and Swedish was one of the languages. So she heard the Bible in her own language, and something changed in her heart when she heard that, and she thought to herself, I wonder if that's true. And so she went back home and asked my friend, hey, can you actually study this book with me? And so they studied the Bible for a while, and a few months later she decides, I'm getting baptized. And so this atheist gets baptized, and she tells her host family, just don't tell my family back at home that this happened, because they would be really disappointed. And so the host family and my friend said, no, we won't tell. And well, she went back to Sweden and back to this atheist environment. So my friend's just praying that she's going to be okay. Well, about 6 months later, my friend is traveling in Europe with a group of teenagers, about 10 teens, and he contacts Sabrina and says, hey, we're actually fairly close to your country. Would you mind if we stop by to say hi? And she said, sure, come on. So they come to her house, and she does remind them, just don't tell my parents that I was baptized. I don't want any praying, no singing. We can visit, but just none of that religious stuff. Okay. Well, they sit down for dinner one day, and kind of at the last moment, Sabrina has this just feeling of courage, and she elbows my friend and says, hey, let's sing a song. And he's like, are you sure? And she says, yeah. So they sing Magnificat. My soul magnifies. They sing that song, 4-part harmony. Well, Sabrina's dad gets up and leaves the room, and her heart breaks. She's like, oh no, I can't believe it. We shouldn't have done that. Well, he comes back in with an iPhone because he wants to film it. And after the song is over, he has tears in his eyes, and he says, that's the most beautiful song I've ever heard. What is it? And well, they tell him, well, it's a story out of the Gospel of Luke, the nativity scene. And he says, that was amazing. This is crazy. He says, will you stay the night, and tomorrow I want you to come down. There's an empty cathedral 2 blocks away. No one goes to church there anymore, but I want that song to fill the hollow walls of that cathedral. I think it'll breathe life there. And so they do. They go and they sing that song in that cathedral. And again, it was amazing to sing that song, and amazing to see what's happening with Sabrina's father. Not only was he not disappointed in Sabrina, but he was super open to faith and to Jesus. In fact, so the dad actually came to the States last year, and he's just learning. Now, he's not a Christian yet, but he's so open to Jesus and to love and to Christianity. And so all that to say, it just takes one person. It would have been really easy for Sabrina just to say, well, there's no way my dad would ever believe this stuff. He's going to be disappointed. But she had this moment of courage where she's like, this has changed my life, and I want to do something about it. And so I think it just takes one, just one person to say, I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to stand up for what's right. I'm going to boldly declare that Jesus is Lord. That it really does make a difference. I'm convinced we need more passion in the world. But we don't need passion about just anything. Like we don't need more passion about sports or politics or YouTube or the clothes that we wear. We need passion about Jesus Christ. Because for far too long, people have tarnished his name, and they've slandered his people, and they've watered down his mission. And it's time for men and women, brothers and sisters in Christ, to stand up and say what Paul said in Romans 1, which is, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it's the power of God. And again, it just takes one person to say, I'm done with apathy. It's a disease. I'm putting it to rest, and I'm going to care like Jesus cared. So the president of Asbury, I watched an interview with him about this revival, and his favorite story of the whole 16 days is, he says on, I think it was day 2, it wasn't huge yet, and there was a few hundred students in the chapel, but there was this one student who hadn't got to go yet, a younger student, and the whole campus was empty, and the president watched as this one young man just sprinted as fast as he could up those steps, because he desperately wanted to be with people who were worshiping Jesus. And I love that image. It's just one kid, just one person, but he wants it. And so you might think about your world like, what do you think would happen just for a week if you stepped it up a notch on passion? Like what do you actually think would happen in your own heart? What do you think would happen in the life of your church? What do you think could happen in the life of your city? I think God could do amazing things through just one person. So what would it look like for you to care like Jesus cared? Let's pause. Talk one more time as we